Happy summer season, everybody, and Tony here with my review of Georg Friedrich Händel's Giulio Cesare in Egitto, which I saw at the Deutsche Oper Berlin. The conductor was Alessandro Quarta. The production was done by David McVicar. The sets were done by Robert Jones. The costumes were done by Brigitte Reifenstuhl. The lights were handled by Paul Constable. The choreographer was Andrew George. The assistant choreographer was Gareth Mole. The fight choreographer was Mark Ruddick. The chorus master was Thomas Richter. The dramaturg was Flavia Wolfgang. And the assistant directors were Eva Maria Abelein and Matteo Marziano Graziano. I mainly knew Händel's Giulio Cesare in Egitto through its arias, especially where Cleopatra's virtuoso arias, such as Da Tempeste and Venere Bella, as well as Piangero la mia sorte, are concerned. Tolomeo's L'Empio Sleale Indegno and Sesto's Svegliatevi nel Core, and the titular hero's aria, which is Va Tacito, among a lot of the arias that I've been acquainted with in this particular opera. I also found it really interesting that it had a history in terms of when it premiered back in 1724 in London. The roles of Giulio Cesare, Tolomeo, Sesto, and Nireno were initially given to castrati, and nowadays these roles could either be sung by mezzo-soprani or countertenors, but with the case of Sesto, it's usually given to either a soprano or a mezzo-soprano. But back in the 1950s and even way before all that, especially when it had its premiere in Germany, the roles were transposed, with Giulio Cesare and Tolomeo given to basses, Sesto Pompeo given to a tenor, and even Nireno also given to a tenor. The only roles that were remaining in terms of Fecha were Cleopatra, who was always a soprano, Cornelia, who was usually given to either a mezzo-soprano or in some cases a contralto, and Aquila and Curio, who were mostly given to basses or bass baritones. It wasn't until the late 1960s that the original keys were restored, and Giulio Cesare, Tolomeo, Sesto, and Nireno could be performed either by mezzo-sopranos or countertenors, with Sesto occasionally being performed by sopranos, and still having the likes of Cleopatra, Cornelia being sung by a soprano and contralto or mezzo-soprano respectively, and the two lower voiced roles of Aquila and Curio still being sung to this day by either basses or bass baritones. So this opera definitely had an interesting history when it came to its transposition of vocal fecha for certain roles, and also one that continued to intrigue me to this day. The basic plot of Giulio Cesare goes like this. Giulio Cesare, or Julius Caesar, finds himself in Egypt alongside his general, Curio, and he encounters Cornelia, who is the widow of Emperor Pompeo, and her son, Sesto Pompeo, considering that Cornelia's husband was killed, and she is in hot pursuit by Cleopatra's brother, Ptolomeo, who lusts after her, as well as Aquila. In the meantime, Cleopatra is completely smitten with Giulio Cesare, considering his reputation as a formidable warrior emperor. And she also fears what is going on with Ptolemaeo's schemes, to the point where Cleopatra disguises herself and renames herself as Lydia, but she also ends up giving herself away as the Queen Cleopatra, much to Julius Caesar's surprise. And both Giulio Cesare and Cleopatra have a romantic relationship with each other. Unfortunately, there's this war occurring between Giulio Cesare and Tolomeo. Giulio Cesare is initially presumed dead, and there's also Sesto's revenge against Aquila and Tolomeo, especially when he wants to avenge his father's death, and Cornelia still being in hot pursuit by Aquila and being lusted after Tolomeo. But everything comes together when Giulio Cesare ends up being alive. Tolomeo tries to make an attempt at Cornelia, but Sesto Pompeo ends up slaying him. And then we have Giulio Cesare and Cleopatra reuniting with each other with much general rejoicing, and both Giulio Cesare and Cleopatra affirming their love for each other. So this was definitely an opera that I found myself really enjoying and also found myself being curious with. And now that I've seen it to its full, I am certainly and absolutely amazed with its overall package. So let's get on to what I thought about the production. It's no surprise that I love David McVicar's productions, especially when it comes to opera. And his production of Georg Friedrich Händel's Giulio Cesare is no exception. He transported the action from between 480 to 479 BC to the 19th century. And it almost feels like the entire sets were based on the likes of Mozart's Die Entführung aus dem Serail, Rossini's Il Turco in Italia, and Rossini's L'Italiano in Algeri. There's a sense of the colonized outsiders basically being British in this adaptation in the forms of Giulio Cesare, Curio, Cornelia, Sesto, and Aquila being the British colonizers and those with British uniforms, and the Egyptians such as Ptolomeo, Cleopatra, and even Nireno, who is also kind of flip-flopping between Giulio Cesare and Cleopatra, being sort of in the middle. But with Ptolomeo and Cleopatra, they are basically affirmed to be Egyptians, almost in the vein of the Turks from Entführung aus dem Serail and Il Turco in Italia, and basically a lot of the Middle Eastern people as portrayed in L'Italiano in Algeri. So there is that sense of othering that is present between Giulio Cesare as the Romans and Cleopatra as the Egyptians, to show that the Romans are essentially the conquerors and those who ensure that the land that they're in is colonized under the king. And we also have the Egyptians, who are essentially the Middle Eastern others and the exotic others. And what I've also noticed about Cleopatra's changes in costumes is that she starts off rather vampish, in that Mae West, Marilyn Monroe appeal. Then in the later parts of the opera, she goes from having all of these skimpy, sexy clothing to wearing a lot more militaristic clothing, to show that Cleopatra is more than just this elegant queen with a whole lot of beauty about her, and sensuality and sexiness and sinuousness. She is also a warrior in her own right who fights for herself, fights for what she believes in, and even fights against her own malicious, scheming brother Tolomeo. Equally as noteworthy in David McVicar's production of Handel's Giulio Cesare is a lot of the dancing and choreography. I do understand that there is a bit of an element of Jean-Philippe Rameau, considering that the likes of Rameau and Lully were renowned for having ballets in their operas. So there is a little bit of that grand opera vibe in terms of adding ballet into certain scenes, and even where the characters not only sing their arias but also dance along with them. So this kind of adds a little bit of concern, because although it does seem quite fascinating to see certain opera singers dance while singing, and it is a very laudable feat in of itself, I still think that opera singing should still be done, but with very minimalistic movement, as the voice is the highest priority. But more power to those singers who manage to break some moves and do it really darn well, aside from just letting their voices out with a lot of passion and interest. And the costumes also did reflect on the whole British colonizers versus the exotic others, with the Roman characters of, like I said, Giulio Cesare, Cornelia, and Sesto being akin to the British, and the Egyptian characters such as Ptolemy and Cleopatra being the exotic others. But with Cleopatra, she basically goes from this exotic and sinuous, sexy queen to a lot more of a militaristic one, to show that she is more than just her looks. She is someone who uses her political influence and who doesn't want to be branded as someone who is quote-unquote uncivilized. Not to mention, there's a great deal of sword fighting and gunfiring involved, even to the point where not only does Cornelia and Sesto stab Tolomeo, but Sesto also ends up unleashing his handgun and also shooting him for good measure. At the end of the opera, all the characters, especially those who were initially dead, such as Aquila and Tolomeo, end up being alive to also wrap it all up, almost akin to those morality tales, and especially when it comes to a lot of the older operas in which all the characters are alive and they give the final message to the viewers. So I still think that David McVicar's production of Handel's Giulio Cesare was a trip and a half, and it was such an intriguing time that I managed to have with this production, all thanks to its intricate set designs as well as its really awesome costumes. And now we get to the singers, starting off with Christophe Dumont as Giulio Cesare. As I stated before, this role was initially written for a castrato, mainly in the contralto territory. But as time went on in the 1900s in Germany, this role has since been transposed to a bass or a bass baritone, with notable exponents including Cesare Siepi and Hans Hotter, as well as Nicola Rossi Lemony. But by the time the 1960s rolled around, this role ended up being retransposed to either a mezzo-soprano or a contralto, with renowned names who sang this role, including the likes of Martin Dupuy, Huguette Tourangeau, and my personal favorite, Janet Baker, who are also very well known in doing pants roles. And what you do need in Giulio Cesare, especially if you're going to give it to a contralto, is that you need someone who could sing the high notes of a Cassandre from Le Troyon and have the middle notes of a Meg Page from Verdi's Falstaff, and of course the chest tones of a First Norn from Wagner's Götterdämmerung. So any singer who does that needs to have not only amazing technique, but also a strong stage presence. And that was what Christophe Dumont had to offer as Giulio Cesare. Really exceptional singing and a strong stage presence that made him stand firmly on his own 2 feet. He did have such a well coordinated and flexible voice to the point where I was in awe of his overall talents. He knew how to add in the nobility and strength to this character and do so with abundant flair. I didn't spot too many flaws in his voice at all. I thought his voice was even and had a fair amount of steel from beginning to end, but I would still encourage him to work on his chest tones, because whenever I think of a true countertenor who had all of that amazing vocal technique, the first name that would come to my mind would be Russell Oberlin. So I do encourage Christophe Dumont to continue to strengthen his technique. But when all is said and done, he was still a charismatic singing actor as Giulio Cesare. Then we have Elena Zalagova, who made such a beautifully sung and awesomely acted and thoroughly charismatic Cleopatra. Cleopatra is definitely not for the faint of heart in terms of sopranos. I would never recommend any light lyric soprano to sing this role, but I wouldn't recommend too much of a heavy voice, because this role is essentially a dramatic coloratura soprano role. It has nevertheless attracted the likes of various sopranos who sang Cleopatra as part of their repertoire, including Renata Tebaldi, who was a spinto soprano, Joan Sutherland, who was a dramatic coloratura soprano, Beverly Sills, who was a lyric coloratura soprano, and Kathleen Battle, who was a light lyric soprano. So this is a role that should combine virtuoso coloratura soprano singing with some absolutely gorgeous legato singing for a lyric soprano. It doesn't matter if it's the bravura aria, which is Da Tempeste, or Piangero la mia sorte, which combines agility and lyricism. And this is definitely what you need for Cleopatra. You need the lyricism of a Susanna or Zerlina from Le Nozze di Figaro and Don Giovanni, and even that nobility found in the likes of La Contessa d'Almaviva from Nozze di Figaro, Elsa von Brabant from Lohengrin, Eva Pogna from the Meistersinger von Nuremberg, and that bigger, stronger singing found in Aida from Verdi's Aida, and even Gulnara from Verdi's Il Corsaro, and some more lyricism found in roles like Suor Angelica from Puccini's Suor Angelica and Liu from Turandot. So basically, Cleopatra is quite the complete package when it comes to coloratura assoluta roles. And Elena Zalagova continues to be a stunner in terms of using her trademark silvery light lyric / lyric coloratura soprano voice to the greatest of her abilities and making the role of Cleopatra her own. That is just how much she continues to wow me as a singing actress. The way she was able to make Cleopatra a hugely fabulous combination of nobility, fun spunk, and charisma, all reflected in how her voice shimmered over the orchestra. managed to make me thoroughly invested with her interpretation of the role. She managed to use her coordinated chest tones exceedingly well. Her high notes were still as crystalline and clear as ever, like a bell at church. And she managed to be a continuously amazing singing actress, complete with a darling stage presence and a whole lot of inner and outer chutzpah to make the role her own and therefore own it with every single fiber of her being and every single fiber of her soul. Stephanie Wake Edwards was an exceptionally phenomenal Cornelia. This role has always attracted a great deal of dramatic mezzo-sopranos and contraltos alike. This is a role that has been consistently given to all of these mezzo-sopranos who can do chest tones exceedingly well and therefore emit those chest tones with everything they got. Well-known interpreters of Cornelia include the likes of Giulietta Simeonato and Sarah Walker, as well as Elena Nicolai, those dramatic mezzos who were renowned for their plush instruments and their overall strong vocal presence. And with Cornelia, you do need the tragic lyricism of a Finenna, that steely nature of a Didon from Berlioz' Le Toyon, and that dramatic intensity found in the second Norn from Wagner's Götterdämmerung. That is just how much strength and beauty and nobility you need as Cornelia. And Stephanie Wake Edwards managed to pull it off all guns blazing. I continue to be astounded, astonished, and excited at just how much Stephanie Wake Edwards continues to grow as a singing actress and an overly technical and awesome singing actress at that. She used her chest voice to her advantage. She used her chest tones to the greatest of her abilities. And especially when it comes to the more dramatic moments, she used them with everything that she's got. She did not hold back whatsoever. She managed to produce those gorgeously powerful, mighty tones with color, charisma, and a great deal of noble strength that I was completely left aghast with just how much she was able to win me over as a singing actress. Martina Baroni was a charmingly wonderful and beautifully steely Sesto Pompeo. Sesto Pompeo was initially written for a soprano castrato, but since the 1900s to the 1950s, it had been taken over by a tenor with some notable interpreters, including Franco Corelli and Fritz Wunderlich. However, since the 1960s, this role had ended up returning to a soprano or a high mezzo-soprano. Some soprano sestos include Lucia Pop and Rosella Ligi, whereas a lot of the mezzos who sang Sesto Pompeo would also dabble in soprano roles, most notably Della Jones, who was really well known in coloratura mezzo roles, but also dabbled in soprano roles such as Donna Elvira from Don Giovanni. In fact, Sesto Pompeo really does need a flexible soprano, let alone full lyric or spinto soprano or falcon type of singer who could also sing the likes of Contessa Almaviva, Dorabella, Donna Elvira, La Cesca, Valentine de Saint-Prix, Alice from Robert le Diable, and even the likes of Elisabetta di Valois from Verdi's Don Carlo, Adalgisa from Bellini's Norma, Romeo from Bellini's I Capuleti e Montecchi, and Le Prince Charmant from Massenet's Cendrillon. And lest I forget about Gutrune from Wagner's Götterdämmerung and Elisabeth from Wagner's Tannhäuser. That is just how much you need for Testo Pompeo in terms of vocal beauty as well as vocal credibility as a young man who wants to avenge the death of his father. And Martina Baroni managed to do all of that vocal work with amazing abandon, beautiful precision, and her chest voice coordination grew with excitement and thorough involvement. I definitely encourage her to strengthen her core a whole lot more, and I definitely encourage her to keep on going in the right direction. She has amazing material to work with, and I salute everything that she had to offer as Sesto Pompeo. Cameron Shabazi was thoroughly charismatic and thoroughly delicious as Tolomeo. Tolomeo was also written for an alto castrato, but since the 1900s to the 1950s, it had been taken over mostly by a bass or a bass baritone, with some notable Tolomeos including Franz Krass, who was one of my favorite singers of Sarastro from Mozart's Die Zauberflöte. But since the 1960s, it had been returned to a contralto or a meteor mezzo-soprano, most notably when it came to singers such as Svetlana Alin, being one of the notable singers of Tolomeo, and even Silvia Tro Santa Fe, who was also a very well-known interpreter of Isabella from L'Italiani Algeri and Sara from Roberto Devereux. So what you really need for Tolomeo, especially if you're going to give it to a mezzo-soprano, is the smoky seductiveness of a Carmen, as well as that might found in Farnace or Arsace from Mitridate di Ponto and Semiramide respectively. This role has been often given to countertenors with some notable names including James Bowman, who was a very renowned interpreter of Tolomeo. And Cameron Shabazi was charismatic and athletic as a performer. I'll give him that. He did have pretty good core. He did have very good head voice, and I definitely need to encourage him to keep on developing his chest voice a lot more, because that is when his voice will thoroughly bloom to full fruition. Even with that one little suggestion for him to do, I still have to give Cameron Shabazi a whole lot of credit for his overall charisma and his overall awesomeness as a singing actor. Michael Sumuel was thoroughly charismatic and strong as Aquila. And Aquila does need the bass baritone voice found in Zuniga from Bizet's Carmen, as well as that dashing nobility found in Il Conte Almaviva from Mozart's Le Nozze di Figaro. And Michael Sumuel, although he was a bit on the 30 side in his vocal emission, he still was able to deliver his music with strength, involvement, and a great feeling for the drama and a great feeling for the operatic art as a whole. He was brimming with charisma, brimming with a whole lot of virility, and therefore I salute Michael Sumuel for what he was able to offer as Aquila. Edu Rojas was charming and absolutely lovely as Nireno. Nireno is definitely a nice and fun part for mostly a countertenor, but there have also been some mezzo-sopranos or contraltos who sang Nireno, most notably Sara Mingardo in the 1980s and 1990s. But even way back then, before it being given mostly to a countertenor, it was given to mostly a light lyric tenor, especially character tenor at that. But it wasn't until the 1960s that this was returned to a countertenor, and a couple of times there would usually be a mezzo-soprano who would usually do the likes of Smeton from Anna Bolena, or even the first maid from Richard Strauss's Elektra singing Nireno. And Edu Rojas was a thoroughly charismatic performer. He had great command of his body. He was a thoroughly charming figure on stage. His stage presence is so addictive to witness. However, I'm not a huge fan of his voice, especially with his overall vocal emission. I felt like it was kind of pale throughout certain parts of his voice, let alone the registers. And I feel like it could use a lot more color, charisma, and interest. But the real Achilles heel comes from his lack of core. And I would really love for Edu Rojas to continue to strengthen his core and to really take advantage of coordinated chest tones and chest tones as a whole so that his voice can truly bloom. He really needs to look at great examples such as Russell Oberlin and even Klaus Nomi, who may not be an opera singer, but he could actually give a whole lot of countertenors of today a run for their money because of how much he used coordinated chest tones and actual chest tones. So he really needs to step up his game, and I really do hope that Edu Rojas continues to sharpen his potential as a fine countertenor. Jared Wehrlein was a handsomely commanding and handsomely strong curio. This role may not be as thankful for many a bass baritone, but it does require a bass baritone to show really great strength as a performer and charisma. And he could also implement that same charisma found in roles such as Figaro from Mozart's Le Nozze di Figaro, Escamillo from Bizet's Carmen, and Zuniga also from Bizet's Carmen to make the role of Curio his own. And Jared Wehrlein continues to wow me with his overall vocal prowess and strength. He was a tall, handsome, and dashing figure on stage, and I salute him for what he was able to do on a consistent basis. I must also give a whole lot of credit to the orchestra players, especially the soloists, including Nathan Geem, Daniel Adam, Tim Ribchester, Arne Christian Paltz, Boris Ballo, Pedro Alcacer, Magnus Andersson, Christiana Gerhardt, and Selim Aikal for all of their wonderful pieces of work in terms of being musicians, as well as the actors Rafael Finkenstedt and Victor Villarreal Solis for doing fabulously, and the dancers Maria Bompoli, Valeria Bustragi, Manuel Meza, and Po Yin Wang for doing such fabulous jobs overall as performers. So overall, this singing was really good all around. The standouts for me were Stephanie Wake Edwards as Cornelia, Christophe Dumont as Giulio Cesare, and Elena Zalagova as Cleopatra. These were the golden standards all throughout because of their amazing vocal prowess. Martina Baroni really improved so much as a singing actress, and she really found the strength to have it a go. I must also give major kudos to Michael Sumuel and Jared Wehrlein for their amazing vocal contributions. Edu Rojas really does need to strengthen his core a lot more and use a lot more chest tones. Similar case with Cameron Shabazi, but I still have to give both Edu Rojas and Cameron Shabazi their flowers in terms of their overall charisma. But when all is said and done, the singing was still really, really good all throughout. It could be a lot stronger in certain roles, but I'm still absolutely thrilled in terms of what they had to produce. The conducting done by Alessandro Quarta was really fabulous all throughout. He was nuanced with all the moments found in the score. He was thoroughly brilliant all throughout. And the chorus and the orchestra of the Deutsche Oper Berlin were, as always, thoroughly brilliant. Georg Friedrich Händel's Giulio Cesare in Egitto at the Deutsche Oper Berlin was definitely a blast, with David McVicar's absolutely intricate production and really good singing all around. This was definitely a fine day's and evening's worth of opera. And for those of you who caught Giulio Cesare at the Deutsche Oper Berlin, what'd you think of it? Did you really enjoy David McVicar's production of this opera? What did you think made it work so well? Who was your favorite of the cast? Or did you feel like this was not something that you would see on a daily basis? Please let me know in the comments below. Well, that's it for my review of Georg Friedrich Händel's Giulio Cesare in Egitto at the Deutsche Oper Berlin. Tune in next time for another review. So until then, have a great summer season, everybody, and please do not forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel.